Pawn to e4. Pawn to e5. Knight to f3. Knight to c6. Bishop to c4. Bishop to c5. Italian game, Giuoco piano. Pawn to c3. Knight to f6. Pawn to d3. Pawn to d6. King to g1. Bishop to b6, prophylaxis against d4. Rook to e1, protecting e4 and preparing the d4 break. The f2 pawn is now only protected by the king. Knight to g4. Rook to e2. King to g8. Pawn to h3, repelling the knight and restricting the action of the c8 bishop. Knight to f6. What has black achieved with his hit-and-run strategy? Did white win a tempo? Well, it turns out that the rook is not well placed in e2. The queens are looking at each other through X-rays and white's queen is unprotected. Rook to e1. Pawn to h6, restricting the action of the c1 bishop. Knight to d2. Knight to e7, planning to transfer the knight to the kingside. The drawback is that the knight leaves the control of the d4 square. Pawn to d4. Knight to c6. No problem. I can go back and now the d4 pawn is attacked thrice. Says the horse neighing. Pawn to a4, a great move. White sacrifices the d4 pawn and creates threats against the b6 bishop. Note that black's dark squared bishop is very restricted and is running out of squares. Black to play. What to move? If pawn to d4. The bishop will not escape alive. And white has compensation for the pawn. Pawn to a5 was played in the game. The best move. Black declines the pawn sacrifice, blocks the a4 pawn and makes room for the bishop. Bishop to b5, a novelty. Move 14 and we reach a new position. There are no games from here in Liang Master's database. White protects d4 by attacking one of his attackers. Pawn to d4. Knight to c4, a great move. White sacrifices the pawn again. The idea is to harm black's pawn structure and get the bishop pair. Pawn to c3. Knight to b6. Pawn to b6. Pawn to c3, a very asymmetric position that is hard to evaluate. White has the two bishops in an open position, but is a pawn down and e4 can be a target of attack. On the other hand, black's pawn structure is harmed. d6 looks weak, but black can prepare to push the pawn to d5. Rook to e8. Queen to c2. Everything revolves around the e4 and d6 pawns. Bishop to d7, unpinning the knight, and preparing the horse jump to e5. Bishop to f4, connecting the rooks and attacking d6. Knight to e5. Knight to d4, centralizing the knight and protecting the b5 bishop. Knight to c6, threatening to swap knights and close the d-file. Can white grab the free pawn with bishop to d6? Of course not, it is tactically protected. Bishop to f1, a nice retreating move. The bishop leaves the b5 square for the knight and also makes possible to take on d6. Pawn to d5. Pawn to e5. The pawn enters enemy territory hitting the f6 knight. Knight to e4. Knight to b5. Bishop to f5, X-raying white's queen and preparing an interesting maneuver. White is lured to play f3 leaving a hole on g3. Bishop to f5 is indeed an attractive move. However, it was more precise to first activate the a8 rook before embarking on an adventure. Pawn to f3. Knight to g3. The knight jumps to the hole and defends the f5 bishop. Queen to d2. Knight to f1. King to f1. Rook to e6, blocking the e5 pawn. Preparing to double rooks and putting an eye on d6. the outpost with the best pastures for the white horse. Rook to d1, hitting d5, white has the center under control. Queen to h4, an interesting move. Black is preparing a little trick to discoordinate white's army. Black plans to slide the bishop to c2 and distract white's queen from the protection of f4. Pawn to g4, cutting off black's queen and attacking the f5 bishop. White decides to sacrifice the h3 pawn to weave a net around black's queen. Queen to h3, the queen enters the tiger's den. King to f2, now the bishop is attacked and white threatens to slide the rook to h1 and trap black's queen. Black to play, what to move? If bishop to g4, a great move. Black gets 3 pawns for the bishop. Fork. Tactically protecting the e6 rook with a deep X-ray on white's king. Opening the f-file. Queen to d5 with equality. Bishop to e4, a mistake. Was played in the game. Pawn to e4. Pawn to e4. Can white fork on circa 7? Of course not, the e4 pawn is very annoying. Rook to e4. Rook to e8. Almost all black pieces are pointing to e5. White to play, what to move? If rook to e1, the e5 pawn is more important than g4. The king runs to the queen's side. Bishop to g3, a obvious move. Was played in the game. Defending g4 and creating a net around the black queen. The problem is that now black can grab the central e5 pawn. Pawn to f5, making a backdoor for the black queen to escape. Pawn to f5. Queen to f5, double attack. Queen to f4. Queen to g6, white has to be careful with the open f-file. Queen to g4. Black to play, what to move? If queen to g4. Grabbing one more pawn for the piece. And white still has the advantage, but black can put up a strong resistance. Queen to f7, was played in the game. Queen to f3. Queen to e7, all black pieces are pointing to e5. Rook to e1. Rook to f8. Rook to f4. Rook to e8. Queen to d5, paralyzing black pieces by pinning the head of the gun. Rook to d8. Queen to c4. King to h7, getting out of the pin. Queen to e4. King to g8. Rook to f3. Queen to c5. King to g2. Rook to e8. Knight to d4, centralizing the knight to finish the game. Black to play, what to move? If rook to e7, a mistake. The knight is untouchable. If the black king takes the knight, white has a forced checkmate. Rook to e5, was played in the game. Bishop to e5. Rook to e5. Queen to h4, the queen defends herself and at the same time protects the e1 rook. Queen to d5. Knight to c6. Rook to g5. King to f2. Pawn to c6. Rook to e8, and black resigns. White is a full rook up and can force the exchange of queens in the next move.